So hi everyone, my name is Anna Maria Nunziata and I am the communication specialist for the Future Skills Center. I'm very excited to join you guys all here today and thank you for joining us at our Infographics for Knowledge Mobilization workshop. I did also want to give a big thank you to our partners for helping us convene today's session, and those are Magnet and Research Impact Canada. Rick and Magnet contribute a lot to FSC's knowledge mobilization strategy. So thank you for convening us here today. To get started, as some of you may be aware, I did want to give a little bit of background about Future Skills Center for those who are new, just to give you a little idea about what we do and some information about us to look forward to. So a little bit of background, the Future Skills Center was launched about 2.5 years ago now, and we are a partnership with Ryerson University, Blueprint, which helps leads our evidence generation strategy and evaluation, and the Conference Board of Canada, who actually helps contribute also in part to our knowledge mobilization and research program. So here at the Future Skills Center, we've been building a future-focused skills innovation hub in Canada to help prepare workers and employers for ongoing labor market changes. We've seen in the last year there has been a lot of changes to the labor market, a lot of changes to education, and so we're working with partners to help navigate these changes. In addition to bringing research to the fore, which is a large part of what we do, we're also building a network of community of practice so we can share what we're learning, what's learning in the skills ecosystem universe, what's not working. And what are the lessons, right? So we've been investing in over 140 pilot projects, innovation pilot projects, with the hope of sourcing innovation really from the ground up, touching every region, sector, and population to scale. So in these partnerships, we're building an evidence base around both how skills are changing and what we can be better prepared for in training and education to equip Canadians with the skills they need going in really to the next decade. The Future Skills Center's strategic plan, I would say, focuses on 4 key areas of work, and I'll just briefly touch on them with you today. So we work with the labor market information experts and partners to provide accurate and practical data, tools, and resources. You may have seen earlier last month, we hosted an event actually on labor market information and practical tools and resources. We are also testing and prototyping, like I mentioned, novel approaches to providing high quality and accessible career and training services. We're also collaborating with sectors and industries to anticipate those labor market trends and help prepare the workforce. And finally, we're building a pan-Canadian network of diverse partners, stakeholders, and collaborators to encourage this ongoing learning and support the adoption of promising practices, practices that are truly backed by evidence. This last point, I think, is particularly important as it brings us here today, right? The FSC is building a suite of tools and resources for knowledge mobilization. One such tool is our community of practice. I mentioned it just a few moments ago. And the community of practice, which is led actually by our partners at Magnet, is a powerful collaboration tool. It brings together practitioners, including researchers, NGOs, policymakers, anyone really working in the skills development ecosystem to help connect, access resources, and engage in discussions really with a national network of leaders and experts. As a reminder, today's resources you can also find them on the Future Skills Community of Practice after the session. So feel free to go ahead and to the COP, make your free account. I believe some of my colleagues are linking to it in the chat. You can also connect with today's facilitator or with FSC really over at the COP if you have any additional questions or topics you'd like to connect with us on. So yeah, I encourage you all to go make your account. You can make it for free at fsc-ccf.ca/COP. And so, back to what I was saying, I was mentioning our aim at the FSC is to promote an inclusive skills development pathways by ensuring knowledge is useful to decision makers, really from the inception of when a research question is developed to the implementation stage, and of course the dissemination and how we share that information in an accessible way that it reaches a wide audience, right? And so today's session, why we're here today, is an opportunity for us to learn more about the foundations for successfully turning into your research, which oftentimes can include dense or complex data into really content-rich visual infographics. Infographics can be a really powerful tool for us to engage in data storytelling and connect with our audiences faster and more effectively. So today's workshop, we'll gain a better understanding of what is an infographic, some of the foundations of that. What are the key components, the benefits to using a visual medium for communication? And we're hoping you can take what we've learned here today and apply it to your current projects and your current work. So with that, I want to get right into it. I know we have a lot ahead planned in the agenda for today. So I'm happy to introduce our facilitator for today. Leading our session is Elizabeth Wong, Knowledge Mobilization Specialist at Research Impact Canada. Again, thank you all for joining us, learning a little bit more about FSC, and now turning it over to you, Liz, to learn more about infographics.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria. So, as we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on, and if applicable, the current treaty holders. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous people. We acknowledge that the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Bell Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping notes. So if you're wondering whether these presentation slide or recording will be shared, yes, they will. And as Anna Maria mentioned before, we have a Future Skills Center community process. So if you haven't signed up already, be sure to sign up and get an account so that you could have access to the presentation slides and recording after the workshop. Some of you might have seen, whether it's through your registration confirmation email or earlier this morning, there are some pre-workshop preparation that we're hoping to get you to help us complete. First, it was to choose a case study or a topic you would like to turn into an infographic, qualitative or quantitative information to develop your infographic, and thinking about who is your target audience. And I like to make workshops more interactive, so there'll be many ways where we're hoping that you'll be able to engage with us, one of which is a Mentimeter, and I'll give you more information a bit later on how you could use Mentimeter and how to get access to it. We're also hoping that you'll be able to engage with us through the Q&A chat box. So through the chat box, if you have any questions, whether it's in English or French, we're happy to answer. Je pourrais aussi répondre aux questions en français ou en anglais. Alors n'hésitez pas à mettre vos questions dans la boîte de clavatage. And then at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A session for you to ask any questions that you may have in regards to this workshop. CC live transcript. If you click on that, automatic live caption to access the video content is available. If you need live interpretation in French, it is available. All you have to click is this button right here. It says interpretation. And as mentioned earlier, questions will be answered in English or French at the end of the session, but my colleagues are also answering questions in the chat box. To start, we wanted to ensure that you have an idea of what are some of the learning objectives that will hopefully you'll be able to gain through this workshop. The first is that through this workshop, we're hoping that you'll be able to gain a better understanding of the roles in infographic and mobilizing knowledge, to have the opportunity to become more familiar with the basic elements of art and principles of design. You won't be a graphic designer, but at least you'll have an opportunity to have the basic fundamentals of art and design, and then also have an opportunity to gain hands-on experience to design, construct a draft infographic. So you won't be able to complete a whole infographic perhaps during this one workshop, but at least having some experience and seeing if you have any questions. And then you could learn also about the different ways that you could share your infographic using different channels. And so today the workshop outline how it will go is that you'll be first introduced to infographic. So the essentials of infographic as well as the different types of infographic. And then we'll share with you some of the factors to help you identify your audience. And then how do you craft your message? And then from there, helping you draft your infographic and what are some of ways to share this infographic. Some of the essential of infographic. And feel free to go to your Dementi.com and use the code 9556-8207 to type in what comes to mind when you think of the word infographic. If you don't have access to Menti.com, feel free to type it in the chat box, what word comes to mind when you think of infographic, or feel free to unmute yourself and share it as well. Different ways of sharing, so feel free to do what's most comfortable for you. So I see a lot of different words that comes to people's mind. Thanks for participating. So some of the main words: visual, communication, information, pictorial storytelling, graphic representation, all excellent responses. The word infographic is an abbreviation of information graphics. Infographics are a type of visual communication, so complex research information can be translated into short, precise text and engaging visuals in one or a few frames. So infographic, as you can see in the next slide, is a combination of complex information, visual, to create that infographic, which consists of visual, color, typography, and graphic to take into consideration. And when you think about information, it could be qualitative information, so it could be about preference, opinion, or emotion, or it could be quantitative information, such as concrete and measurable data and statistics, which gives you knowledge, insight, and perspective when you combine information with graphics. And in your opinion, what are some of the benefits to using visuals to communicate a message? Likewise, feel free to use Mentimeter or type your response in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself and share your response as well. Thanks. Great, thank you for your participation. So we see that some of the responses is that it's easier to understand, it's quick, easy at a glance, info that's easily digestible, better to understand, appealing, accessible, catches attention, fit for all types of audience. Absolutely, a picture can be better to demonstrate something as opposed to just words and numbers. Great responses. I love how one person said it was like impactful, engaging, and high impact. I absolutely agree with all of your responses. So to summarize some of the responses that were mentioned, things that were found was that some brains process information visual better than text. It is a simpler way to understand information. It's also flexible form of communication compared to verbal communication, which makes it a cross-cultural way of communicating. It is a way to grab attention, given that it's eye-pleasing and aesthetic. It is easier to also deliver concise pieces of information. You can also identify relationship between data, and even when you encounter nebulous concepts and large numbers, infographic is an excellent way to illustrate this in a more simpler manner, and then allows you to make quick analysis and decisions as well. I'm just going to jump in to also introduce you to a few types of infographic. Now, there's a lot of different types of infographic out there, but these are just some of the common ones. So, for instance, geographic infographic. Geographic infographic are those that use this map, whether it's hyperlocal or global maps, to illustrate trends with geographical relevance. There is also list infographic that helps to support a claim with a list of key points. Statistical infographics are ones that you would find a lot of numerical data that uses charts, graphs, and other visual representation of the statistical data. Process infographic explains the steps involved in a process on a sequential and logical order. There's also comparison infographic, which illustrates the difference between two or more concepts, ideas, or other that are very similar, and often is illustrated in a way that is like side by side, so you could easily identify and compare the two. Like the timeline infographic shows a chronological story of a concept, product, service, or person. And then visual article infographic is really different components of a text or article broken into different elements. So different elements referring to definitions, checklists, comparisons, etc. That makes it a writing more visual. So I'm going to just show a few examples that the Government of Canada has created. So for a geographic infographic, this visual shows the population growth of Canada across provinces in July 1st, 2020 as of then. And so you could see based on the numbers, where has population growth been highlighted. There's also a statistical infographic. So a statistical infographic is a visual that shows different statistics related to the well-being of youth, non-employment, education, and training in Canada between the years of 2015 and 2017. And so over here, you can see a donut shape and representing statistics. Here you could see bar graphs and having different statistical information being represented. And then there's also other visuals here representing statistical information. Next is a timeline infographic. This timeline infographic shows the steps that are taken into account to consult on the reform of child and family services on the co-development of a proposed legislation from 2015 when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls for Indigenous child welfare legislation to 2020 when the act came into force. And then there's also a list infographic. This specific list infographic from the Government of Canada shows a list of Canadian charters of rights and freedom, where a brief description of fundamental freedom, democratic rights, mobility rights, legal rights, equality rights, official language right, minority language education rights as well. And so all of these infographics I've shown you are available on Government of Canada's website. When you receive these slides, you could click on it in order to view it in a larger format so it's easier on the eyes. But also my colleague is posting the link in the chat box for those who want to view it in a larger format. Great. So now that I've introduced you to a few infographics, it'll be great to see how's your knowledge of different types of infographics. So for instance, for this infographic, it shows the difference in participation rates in college and university studies of those who are 18 to 24 years old between 2000 and 2001 and 2018 and 2019. If you were to think, what kind of infographic is this? Most of you have indicated that this is a comparison infographic, and you're absolutely correct. And I could see why it's a bit confusing in the sense that there is also statistical information as well as there's a map here which illustrates a geographical infographic, but over here there's also statistical information. So I could see why some people might have indicated a statistical infographic and some might have thought, oh, maybe it could be a geographic infographic, but because this is an option, then it wasn't indicated. And so your answers are all correct. It's that because this is specifically focused on comparing the difference in participation rates in college and university studies of 18 to 24 years old between two time periods, then their focus was more on creating a comparison infographic. And so how about the next one? We have a infographic that shows the steps involved in the legislative and the process and the regulatory process. Feel free to pick the type of infographic that you think it is. Do you think it's a process infographic, perhaps a geographic infographic, or a timeline infographic, or a visual article infographic? Great. Thank you so much for those who participated. Most of you are absolutely correct. It is a process infographic. Not only in this process infographic does it show one process in a sequential order, but it shows two processes. The first process is the legislative process, and then the second process is the regulatory process on how new laws and regulations are created. Thank you for your participation. And then we'll be moving to our final infographic examples, where you will see a visual that shows various information of journey persons in Canada, from mobility earnings to pathways using different elements. such as a timeline, statistics, and other visuals. What type of infographic do you think this is? Do you think it's a visual article infographic, a process infographic, a timeline infographic, or perhaps a comparison infographic? So congratulations, there is a visual article infographic, as most of you have mentioned. The reason why is because, as you can see, while there is statistics here and there's also some visuals, it's like different elements coming together. And there's also like a timeline, as we can see here. But because there's all these different components of different elements to show the various information of journey persons in Canada from mobility, earnings to pathways, then we'll consider this as a visual article infographic. Thanks. So now have exposure to all of these different types of infographic. Think about what will work best for your infographic that you'll be working on during this workshop very shortly. When we think about infographic topics, there's a variety of them. It is now your turn to come up for an infographic topic that you would like to consider work along for this workshop. As you were exposed earlier to some of the common types of infographic, such as a timeline infographic, a list infographic, a process infographic, a geographic infographic, statistical infographic, comparison infographic, and visual article infographic. Think about what kind of infographic do you want to apply or create to draft during this workshop. If you haven't come up with a topic yet for this workshop, just to give you some ideas for infographic topic that you could choose, are, for instance, a timeline infographic. Maybe you want to show a visual that tells a chronological story of how your program became what it is today since its inception. Or you might perhaps thinking about a topic of what a participant may need in order to take part in your program. So you might use a list infographic for that. Or maybe you have a bunch of data that compares your project results before COVID-19 and after COVID-19. So you might consider using a comparison infographic. Or you might be wanting to tell a story to describe to your audience about your program or your project or process. And then you might consider using a process infographic if you're thinking about, what if I want to show to my audience how do they enroll in the program that you're designing? Or maybe what you really want to create is a map that shows all of the different types of program participants in your training program across Canada. Then you might want to use a geographic infographic. And then if you have a lot of quantitative information and you want to demonstrate the impact perhaps of your course that has had on the different learners in your program, or other kind of achievements where you've gathered a lot of statistical information, perhaps a statistical infographic is the best way to go. And so I'll give you a few minutes to think about what type of infographic that you want to create. Maybe 1 minute, jot it down. And once you're done, I'm happy to go on to the next one. Perfect. So our next session talks about identifying your audience. And so what I mean by identifying your audience, when you're thinking about your target audience, there's different elements and components that you have to think about. While sometimes we want to share the infographic to our general audience, it might be good to target a specific audience. And so when you're targeting a specific audience for your infographic, there are certain components that you have to consider. So does your target audience understand the language in which you're communicating the information in to ensure that there is no language barriers? Or if you're thinking about your audience, what is their literacy and numeracy level? So when I'm talking about numeracy, it's the knowledge and skills and behavior to understand and apply mathematical concepts, processes, and skills in various situations. And when I'm referring to literacy, I'm referring to your target audience ability to read, write, and speak in the language that you're providing the infographic in. So that's why plain language writing is so important, so that you're not adding jargon, or depending on how familiar the audience is with the concept of the message. Because and then also thinking about, is your target audience interested in the message? Because different audience have different interests. And so you want to make sure that you're catering to the different interests of your target audience. And then also thinking about the cultural context in which your infographic is presented in. So for instance, the Canadian Food Guide, given that Canada is such a multicultural country. If you're targeting a specific, for instance, group and their meals might be different in terms of their diet, then you want to use food that represent their cultures when you're illustrating, for instance, how much carbs should a person have, how much protein should a person have in their daily diet. Or you're sharing your infographic to a remote location where internet is not accessible, then you might want to reconsider the channel in which you're sharing the infographic in. Perhaps you might want to just distribute it to the community using paper, and then also thinking about the abilities and disabilities of your audience. So for instance, if your audience might have some visual challenges, you might want to make sure that your typography is in a legible font, or also you might want to make the font bigger, and we'll go in further details in regards to how to make your infographic more accessible. So with the introduction of a little bit about the different components you should consider for your target audience, I'll just give you a minute to think about can be your target audience, and also thinking about all of the factors that we previously mentioned that you need to take into consideration when thinking about your specific target audience. Feel free to jot it down, and if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, or feel free to type it in the chat box, and one of my colleagues will also be happy to answer it. And if you've already identified your target audience and you wish to share with members of the workshop, feel free to do so. Does anyone want to share their target audience that they've identified with group? If not, no worries. We'll move on to crafting the message. So for the infographic, when crafting the message, it's important to determine what is the objective of your message. When you're thinking about the objective of your message, it should be one that your audience will be able to quickly and precisely understand. Your audience should be able to feel moved by the information that they're getting from the infographic, and there should be a call to action. So after they've seen your infographic, they'll know, okay, what can I do now? And so as you're developing the message, there are a few steps that you can take to craft the message. So first, you would need to collect the data that helps provide context to support your key point, the objective of your message. And then when you have collected a bunch of data, it's time to organize it. So you want to organize it in a way that's logical and matches the reading order of the content to the design. So it might be from top to bottom. And then you want to use headings and subheadings to help you organize this content. And when you're using different headings and subheadings, make sure that you're using a clear and descriptive title. And if you're thinking about numerical processes, numerical lists are super helpful to help you in numbering the processes. And once you've collected your data, organized your content, you're now ready to craft the message. When you're crafting the message, make sure that it is a message that is clear and easy to understand, so that it's written in clear language. You may want to also make sure that you're using appropriate tone and language. Try to avoid using jargon, or try to avoid using language that might not be familiar to your target audience. So thinking about their literacy and numeracy level, thinking about, is this the language that they're comfortable and familiar with? These are just some examples to help you think about what is the appropriate language and tone for your audience. And try and avoid using paragraphs or center text, because that could look a little bit too cumbersome, and you just want to make sure everything is organized and easy to understand, easy to read. Great. So I'm just going to give 5 minutes to reflect, craft your message. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, or feel free to enter into the chat box, and my colleagues will be happy to answer it. If you would like to share your message, if you've already crafted it, feel free to do so. So I'll just give everyone 5 minutes to craft their message. Thanks. Now is the exciting part. We'll be going into how you could design and construct your draft infographic. So here are some tools that we've identified for creating an infographic. So some of these include BeFunky, Snapchat, Easily, Infogram, Canva, Visme, PowerPoint, and Pictochart. And prior to this workshop, we suggested that you create an account on Canva, but you could create an infographic not only with these tools, but even a paper and pencil works. If you have ever had the opportunity to use any of the tools that are listed here today, perhaps you've used the Funky, Snapchat, Easily, Gram, Canva, Disney, PowerPoint, or flowchart to create an infographic. If no, that's totally fine. If so, I would love to hear your experience as well. So I'll give maybe a few more seconds for those to respond to the poll. A lot of you have had the opportunity to use different tools to do an infographic. Would anyone like to share experience using any of these tools? If so, feel free to unmute yourself and share. I see in the chat box, Galaxy A525G has mentioned that Disney or PowerPoint or Canva can be pretty good for visual. However, it can be difficult to navigate. Yeah, that is a good point. I'm glad, Sabina, you had the opportunity to start playing with Canva and found it easy to use. Teresa mentioned that Pictochart is super user-friendly and has great visuals. Yeah, definitely. And for those who've had a chance to download Canva, we are happy to also briefly show a little. They already have template there. So if you type in infographic, once you sign into your Canva account, there's a number of them that you can actually choose. And depending on what kind of infographic you're looking for, then you can modify it to what you are developing a topic for. So for instance, they also have something called data infographic. And if you're looking to maybe create a process, then you could click on this one and then replace it by your content. If you're looking for a visual article infographic, here there is like a donut chart, but then there's also like a histogram. And maybe, for instance, here is also like a visual article infographic, but perhaps the information that you've gathered is not necessarily COVID-19. Maybe you want to know a little bit about your organization, so you can modify it easily and type in like the content that you want and modify the color, modify typography that your organization branding uses. You could also easily feel free to change the different images depending on what your topic is and what would suit your audience. And feel free to use Writer, Editor, Illustrated, Graphics, or even photos. Canva has a lot of great options, so feel free to pick ones that works best for you. In Canva, you saw some of the different photos you could use for your infographic, but beyond just finding photos within Canva, there's also really great resources for royalty-free or copyright-free images, and you could find that with sites such as Pesos, Flat Icon, Unsplash, Flickr, Pixabay, and the Noun Project. I'm also a little bit curious, have anyone used any of these resources in the past when looking for images? It seems that a lot of you have used these resources already. There are any other resources that you found that have royalty-free or copy-free images that are not already listed? Feel free to add it in the chat box when we're sending you the recording or slides or putting on the community of practice. We'll be also happy to include these additional resources to share with members of our audience. So perfect. I see Mary has put creativecommons.org. Thank you, Mary. And if you have used any of these resources for royalty-free or copyright-free images, whether it's Pesos, Flat Icon, Unsplash, Flickr, Pixabay, or the Noun Project, what did you think about them? Were they useful? Which ones did you find most helpful? Why? Feel free to enter your response in the chat. Jackie put agingbetter.resources space. Oh, that's really interesting. I haven't tried it, but I'll be sure to look into it. Thank you, Jackie. Great. So thank you so much for participation. And now we'll move on to the tools design. So there's several tools that you could use for designing your infographic. The tools of designs are the parts that define the visual. They are ways to emphasize or distinguish content. While color is a big one, it's not the only one. As you can see here, other ways to emphasize or distinguish content can be texture, lines, values, shapes, size, and scale. But given that color does affect your audience ability to receive information, we would recommend that you choose a color or shade that provides at least a contrast ratio of 3:1. And as I mentioned earlier, that's really important in terms of making your content accessible to your audience. So when you're trying to achieve a contrast of at least 3:1, making sure that your foreground and background color has that contrast. Your text color and your background color has the contrast ratio of at least 3:1. And your linked text and your surrounding unlinked text has a color ratio of at least 3:1. So here we provided a few tools to help you determine the contrast ratio. So web accessibility in mind and contrast ratio. And I'll just show very briefly what I mean by contrast ratio. As you can see earlier, put the hex color to happy faces in the top point. Over here, you can see that one happy face is a darker green, and then one happy face is a lighter green on the background color of a gray. The gray is represented by the hex color of E6, E6, E6. So this is the gray of the background color that we saw earlier. Happy face was represented by the hex color of 54803A. And then we could see that this helps achieve a 3.7 ratio. So that makes it easier to see and is accessible. However, for the lighter green, the hex color was 8DD200. See that the lighter green is harder to see because the contrast ratio is only 1.48. And so it even gives you an example of how your text will look like when your background is a light gray, using it on the lighter green. That's why it's so important to choose a text color that makes the text content readable or an image visible. And then last but not least, make sure that information in color cues is accessible in text, or use other non-color visual cues to make it accessible. So as I mentioned earlier, color doesn't have to be your only way of emphasizing or highlighting certain content in your infographic. You could always, for instance, make an object larger to emphasize the importance of it. As we see here, values, a darker value will be stronger in presenting a certain element, or you can use different shapes to show the differences between different elements. Aside from that, the principles of designs are also ways in which we use elements to create a visual and conveying a message. They're widely used to create pleasant and effective visuals. So some of the principles that are shown here consist of repetition, space, contrast, proximity, alignment, and balance. And principles serve as some general way in which many people is able to better perceive infographic. So even for example, contrast, as you can see, all of these balloons are light blue, but then the red one that goes up and is in another different color, this one definitely sticks out. In your infographic, there may be some text. And when you're using text, it's important to use selectable text instead of images of text. The reason why we suggest that is because true or selectable text enlarges better, it loads faster, is easier to translate, and simpler to customize, so it's more accessible to your audience. And when you're thinking about how to make content more readable, we suggest to pick a typography that is easy to read. So using sans serif font instead of serif font, and using optimal readable text font size. So larger text font size, but also recognizing that in your design, you might not necessarily make it too big, so one that people can read. So alternate text can help your audience with visual challenges who cannot see images. So here's some do's and don'ts that we recommend. So for instance, when you're using alternate text, make sure that you're describing the information and function of the image's content, or providing a transcript for infographic in an image format, whether it's in JPEG or PNG, or ensuring that the information on the transcript is the same information as the information on the transcript. And then when the screen reader reads decorative image, your audience will understand that it is an image that doesn't convey a specific pertaining information, but it is there as a decorative text. And you do want to indicate the destination of the link in the alternative text for link images. Some things that we recommend to avoid is to avoid using the file name as the text alternative, such as your image is October. Avoid saving the name october.jpg, putting it into alternative text. And we recommend that you avoid using phrases like image of or graphic of in the alternative text because it is already an image in itself. And try and avoid repeating information that's already presented in the adjacent caption in the surrounding text. So for instance, if you have an alternative text and then you have a caption right under it, maybe try to avoid repetitiveness. Alternative text should serve as the equivalent purpose as the non-text content. So if an image is swapped with the text alternative, the alternate text reader should be able to understand the same information, perform this function as a person who can see the image. And so sometimes you might want to add links into your infographics. And if you do choose to add links into your infographic, here are some things that we recommend to consider. When you're adding links, try and use a link text that is descriptive, and the descriptive text should be clear and accurate. Another recommendation is that you want to make the link text as easy as possible to recognize. So one tip to do so is to use more than just color to distinguish your link text. For instance, you might choose to underline it. And then use unique link text unless the links are leading the audience to the same destination. And make the keyboard focus indicators easy to identify visually. And avoid using ambiguous link text such as like click here, more, or continue, because we don't know where is that leading. For instance, if we were to share more about the event and we want to recommend you to click the event registration page, instead of just putting click here, we recommend you pressing visit the event registration page and then hyperlink event registration page. I want to give you some time to try and design and construct a draft infographic. Some of the tools that we mentioned earlier, and my colleague Felix will pop it back into the chat box for you to explore some of the tools and resources we shared earlier to create that draft infographic. But if you wish to use paper and pen, that works totally fine. And if you have any questions during this process of designing and constructing your draft infographic, feel free to ask, and we're more than happy to support you. Given the interest of time, maybe 10 minutes, we don't expect you to complete a full infographic, but it at least gives you some time to think about it, to draft something on paper. And as you're going through this process, if you have any questions, then we're here to provide live support to you. And I'll be checking the chat box if there's any questions. But again, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and feel free to ask your questions directly. Instead of 20 minutes, doing 10 minutes, so maybe at 2:18, feel free to take that time to design your infographic and construct it. I see an excellent question from Sabina. Might you have a checklist or a list of questions to reference before starting to design infographic to help with organizing the purpose of the infographic, ensuring that's on point as much as possible? I think that's an excellent point. Perhaps we could create something like that as a resource to really think about before creating an infographic. So we'll be sure to make a note on that for the future. Thank you, Sabina. And I also see Sarah has an excellent question here about making infographic accessible. When you're using alternative text and formatting other than PDF, PowerPoint actually also allows you to save your infographic, and it will also measure how accessible your content is. So you could always save it in PowerPoint as another way of having the infographic as a format more accessible. But it also depends what channel you choose to deliver your infographic in. Thanks for your question, Sarah. So with Canva, what I could just do is demonstration. And I'll just show like the 1 in 4 people. Are you referring to this as like the different types of people? And then over here, there's like total item, filled items, and spacing. So let's say because your total item is 1 in 4 people, so there's 4 people, and then but you only want 1 of the 4 filled, then you type in 1 here, and then MSA, because they're too close together, you want to give them some space. And so now there's like 1 in 4 people. But you could feel free to change the color. So if you want to fill them in red, for instance, and then the background can be like darker pink, and feel free to do that. Does that answer your question, Sarah? Okay, perfect. Thanks. 1 more minute. Feel free to draft your infographic. Again, we don't expect you to have a final product at the end of this workshop, but at least it gives you an idea of how to go about drafting an infographic. And if you need any support, we're here to answer some of your current questions. But like I mentioned, I will also share with you my email in case you do have any questions afterwards, or if once you gather more data, then we'll be able to support you in that aspect as well. Now going on to sharing your infographic, there's various ways to share your infographic. Share your infographic online using slides, for instance, or you could do so in person or using printed materials. So as I mentioned earlier, if your target audience is one that might not have access to internet, and they might need infographic that is printed, so feel free to consider using printed media such as poster, brochure, leaflets. Infographic can also appear in institutional documents such as reports. It makes it easier when you have a text-heavy document and transforming some of that heavy text content into visual, simple information such as an infographic. Or feel free to share your infographic using social media such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and etc. Nowadays, a lot of people have access to a mobile, and so you might choose to share your infographic using a mobile. If you do choose to share your infographic in a way that's accessible by mobile phone, some tips that we recommend is that the infographic should be able to be read by a mobile device screen reader. So iOS, if you're using an iOS mobile, VoiceOver, Android, TalkBack, and the links within your infographic should be functional when using a mobile device. So you just want to double check after you created it on the computer to check it if it is accessible and functional on your mobile. And then when you are zooming into the infographic, you want to make sure that the content does not overlap with one another, or that and if they are being zoomed in, that the content is able to be resized properly. What are other ways that you think are great to disseminate infographics? So beyond social media, printed materials, or in person or online, or other ways that you are thinking of sharing your infographic or have shared your infographic in the definitely in applications, social media reports, online posters, all really good answers. I love this idea of what someone mentioned, that you could break out into chunks of infographics in order to post on social media, so you could concentrate on specific parts. Because for instance, a visual article infographic, there's so many different elements, and as we've seen in some of the examples earlier, you could find like a geographic infographic and a statistic infographic all within one visual article infographic. So when you do break it out, it might be easier to digest as well. So excellent point from a member of our audience as well. And I see another member of the audience also mentioned create social media snippets of your infographic. Really great points. Yes, newsletters, website, absolutely. Perfect. Thank you so much for your participation and all excellent ideas. Before we end it off, we just want to give you some time and space for any questions or that you would like to end off with. If not, that works too. I'll be staying maybe like a few more minutes if anyone has any questions after this workshop to answer any specific questions that you may have. And again, I'll also pop up my email in the chat box. So if you do have any questions in the future, you could ask me. But thank you so much for coming. Here are some of the contact information if you want, because we do encourage you to stay connected. Our Future Skills Center, they have Twitter as well as LinkedIn and Instagram and website that you could access. Feel free to stay connected with Manual or Research Impact Canada as well. We have new opportunities dedicated to helping Canadians gain the skills they need to thrive at the Community of Practice. If you haven't signed up already, be sure to sign up for an account on the Community of Practice, Future Skills Center, Manual Community of Practice.